So as we're still in Unit 1, setting the stage for the biblical history and the revelation that comes through God's call of Abram and Sarai from Ur of the Chaldees, we're going to look at the background of Genesis chapter 1 to 11 from both the concept of the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1, followed by 2, and into chapter 3 and 4 that we alluded to briefly in the previous introduction. So we'll look at the wide variety of ancient Near Eastern mythology that we believe that the biblical story of God's creative work stands in contrast to, and in many ways is a polemic, an argument against this misunderstanding of the ancient world and the relationship between humanity and deity that gets developed into just a variety of mythologies of the ancient world, in which concepts of deity, which are reflective of human nature and character and the human creative cycle, that is, of birth and generations, that in the ancient world people created generations of deities just as people create generations of humanity. So you have in the creation narrative, for example, of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, that you have a pair of male and female deities procreating and producing other male and female pairs of deities, and you go down through many, many generations of deity in this mythological polytheistic world that is reflective of how people in the ancient world, in the state of humanity post-fall, created this world of human and divine interaction, interrelationships, and how those were played out in daily life and the practices of the people. But we'll look at, again, as I mentioned in a previous introduction, the nature of the cyclical character of the Genesis 1, and that rolls over into chapter 2 in explaining the details of the human relationship of male and female, and then that which it leads into the fall. And I mentioned before about the connective tissue that goes between the different parts of the cyclical narrative of Genesis 1 through 4. That is, we take Genesis 1, 26 and 27, the creation of humanity in God's image, male and female, and then their responsibility to oversee the earth. They are given dominion over that which God had created. And that is the story that is further developed, explicated in chapter 2 in the male and female relationship and the dominion of male and female over the creative world. And so you have, for example, Adam's naming of the animals, which is a wisdom, what we call an onomasticon, is a wisdom theme, and the relationship between Adam and Eve and the animals of creation, oversight of the development of plants and trees and the productivity of food supply and so forth are the themes of chapter 2. And it's also, of course, a celebration of the male and female relationship. And then, of course, the story there ends with a very interesting phraseology that in the garden that God had created, and he put man and woman in the garden, is that they were in a state of nakedness but not ashamed. They were unashamed. And in chapter 3, that aspect of nakedness is brought forth as part of the shame of the fall. And it's very interesting that aspects of nakedness in the modern world of the exploitation of the male and female body in our world of pornography is a theme that very much carries forth in the fall narrative of chapter 3. Because now you have that which was unshameful had become shameful in chapter 3, as God is calling forth for Adam and Eve in the garden. And the question is, who told you you were naked? And so this now has become a source of shame. And another aspect that's very interesting to this cyclical story is each of those three stages ends in a poetic you have to actually get into the Hebrew of Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27, creation of humanity, male and female, to see the poetic nature of the construct of those two verses. And that, of course, in chapter 2 is Adam's proclamation of bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. And then, of course, in chapter 3, the poetic forms come in the curses upon the serpent in the garden and upon the male and female. And so that is chapter 3. Chapter 4 rolls into then the further results of the fall in the fratricide, the Cain and Abel story, and we're introduced to the offering of sacrifices in that context, and the issue of the degeneration of humanity as a result of the fall that ends up with Cain killing Abel over an issue of acceptability before God. And so we study that. And then as we go on, we'll see then the opening of the story in the various cycles of material that then move up to chapter 6 in the narrative that leads to, again, the continued descent of the character of humanity that eventually leads to the flood, the Noah narrative, and again, all of this beginning the story with Noah of the concept of the redeeming of humanity through a small group of people, like he will do with Abraham and Abraham's family, beginning in the end of chapter 11 and into chapter 12 of Genesis. Well, that's, again, the creation narrative. We'll also look at the varieties of issues that we learned about in the character of humanity from the prehistory that we learned from archaeology, from the Natufian and Neolithic periods up through the early Bronze Age. The early Bronze Age of Mesopotamia begins around 3500, 3300 BC and goes down to about 2000 BC. And this is the period of, for example, in Egypt, the flowering of Egyptian civilization, the coming together of Upper and Lower Egypt, somewhere around 32 to 3300 BC, and most of the pyramids are built. When Abraham, for example, around 2000 BC, makes his first journey down into Egypt, most of the pyramid construction is long, history of the past. In some cases, hundreds of years before Abram, the beginnings of the pyramid era, and the flowering of the ancient early Bronze Age Egyptian civilization. Similarly, in the Sumerian world, in which Abraham is called, is part of this 3rd millennium BC world. And we'll look at, again, aspects from early humanity on through the early Bronze Age in the study of the prehistory of God's focal point in the calling forth of Abraham and the descendants that would be the chosen people of Israel, for his plan to bring forth the blessing to the nations as described in the call of Abraham in chapter 12.